Content warnings for this episode are for discussions of medical misogyny and medical abuse, particularly the medical abuse of ME/CFS patients. So, why is the name chronic fatigue syndrome such a terrible one? First of all, it's insulting, frankly, to patients because it reduces a very complex and extremely disabling condition down to just one of its main symptoms. As I've already covered, the word fatigue is the closest thing we have in English to describe the paucity of energy this illness leaves you with, but it is very far from adequate to describe it. Fatigue is something we all experience. We all get tired sometimes. Even I get tired on top of this illness, mostly because of all the bullshit I have to deal with because I have it. But what tends to happen with this new name is that people hear it and they end up thinking that too, that we all get tired sometimes, but we push through because we don't really have a choice if we want to put food on the table at the end of the day. But that's the thing, with this illness, you can't push through. Something has gone seriously wrong with our energy metabolisms, and if we try to power through, we pay for it with PEM, and if we keep that up for too long, with potentially a permanent reduction in our baseline health. But you wouldn't know that by hearing the name chronic fatigue syndrome. Chronic fatigue in itself is a symptom of many illnesses, both physical and mental, and it's also just a thing that people experience as a part of modern life. So this name is far too broad and really doesn't describe at all what this illness actually is, what it does in the body, or how disabling it can get. If anything, what this name does is point fingers at patients who seemingly just can't push through the tiredness like everyone else. It makes us out to be lazy people, but laziness doesn't have anything to do with it. We're very badly sick. Dr. Charles Shepherd of the UK's ME Association, a charity that has supported patients since the 1980s, sums up the name well when he said, "Chronic fatigue syndrome is an absolutely dreadful name for a serious and debilitating neurological illness. It's the equivalent of saying someone with dementia has a chronic forgetfulness syndrome. CFS needs to be placed in the medical dustbin of obsolete names as soon as possible." Also, a side note, the ME Association is an absolutely incredible charity and they've been supporting ME patients for decades now. There are so many good resources on their website, so I'll link to it below. In summary, this new name, gifted by the CDC, I should note, paved the way for patients to be further mistreated, overlooked, stigmatized, and sadly abused in the future. Now it's time to focus on what is potentially the most important chapter in the history of ME. It was around this time in the 1980s that a group of psychiatrists in the UK really took an interest in ME. These psychiatrists belong to that group number 2 of researchers. They were dead set on the idea that this condition is psychological in nature, and they used the biopsychosocial model that I mentioned in the last episode as a template to try and explain why. If we use this model to more accurately explain what's really going on for these patients, and I as a patient myself will try to do this, we might say that ME is a biological illness for which there seems to be some degree of genetic predisposition and which is triggered in the majority of cases by a viral infection or otherwise some other stressor on the immune system. ME symptoms then lead to a significant loss in quality of life, resulting in psychological distress and possibly even clinical anxiety or depression. It may also lead to job loss or the breakdown of relationships, which creates even more distress. Patients can be helped in a lot of ways by being offered psychological support or financial support in the form of disability benefits, for example, and this would help improve their overall quality of life. But if you really want to tackle the root cause, you should look to the biology sphere. Biology is where this all starts. So if you could treat the illness there, like with effective pharmaceutical intervention, then that would have the greatest positive impact on patients' overall health. This is not how those psychiatrists were looking at things. They considered the then lack of biomedical explanation for the disease not to be a sign of inadequate testing and the need to investigate further, but rather as a confirmation in itself that there was no biomedical explanation to be found. According to them, a patient would get sick from an infection or from something else and would then become deconditioned as a result. When a patient attempted to return to their normal level of activities, they would encounter difficulty and experience some symptoms as a consequence of this deconditioning. This negative experience makes the patient believe that they are still sick, so they become afraid of exercise. Patients get stuck in a cycle of avoiding exercise, suffering greater muscle weakness, becoming more deconditioned, and then continuing to avoid exercise. If a person were to receive outside support, like from the welfare state or patient support groups, it would only confirm the delusion that they are still sick. So, the treatment for these patients is to tell them to suck it up, to have them do exercise to undo the deconditioning, and break the cycle of false illness beliefs. This is bullshit. This is not how this disease works at all. We can prove that it can't be fully explained by deconditioning alone, and moreover, this is an incredibly cruel way of looking at it. What this is blaming the patient for their own illness. If things were as simple as not believing you were sick and just getting on with exercise, we wouldn't have any ME patients to begin with. But tragically, this view of the disease is largely what's stuck, in part thanks to the unfortunate involvement of the media, who also ran with the narrative that patients were making their illness up. This view grew increasingly popular and appeared more and more credible as this group of psychiatrists became more vocal, and that group one of researchers, those who rightly believed this illness is biological in nature, became sidelined. Emmy was psychologized. Bria, an ME patient and advocate, sums up very well her experience of psychologization with this disease in her TED Talk from 2017. I think her talk is incredible, and you should absolutely listen to the whole thing if you're able to, but I'll share just a few clips from it for now so you can get a better idea of just how deep the psychologization of ME runs. Hi, so originally I was just going to play some clips from this TED Talk for this video, but I'm too scared of getting copyright striked, so instead I'm just going to read out and quote some of what she says in this TED Talk. She said, I saw every kind of specialist, infectious disease doctors, dermatologists, endocrinologists, cardiologists. I even saw a psychiatrist. My psychiatrist said, it's clear you're really sick, but not with anything psychiatric. I hope they can find out what's wrong with you. The next day, my neurologist diagnosed me with conversion disorder. He told me that everything, the fevers, the sore throats, the sinus infection, all of the gastrointestinal, neurological, and cardiac symptoms were being caused by some distant emotional trauma that I could not remember. That day, I ran a small experiment. I walked back the 2 miles from my neurologist's office to my house, my legs wrapped in this strange, almost electric kind of pain. I meditated on that pain, contemplating how my mind could have possibly generated all this. As soon as I walked through the door, I collapsed. My brain and spinal cord were burning. My neck was so stiff I couldn't touch my chin to my chest, and the slightest sound, the rustling of sheets, my husband walking barefoot in the next room, could cause excruciating pain. I would spend most of the next 2 years in bed. In 1980, hysteria was officially renamed conversion disorder. When my neurologist gave me that diagnosis in 2012, he was echoing Freud's words verbatim, and even today, women are 2 to 10 times more likely to receive that diagnosis. In my opinion, ME is an illness with a few characteristics that make it particularly vulnerable to being psychologized. Firstly, as Jennifer Bria points out, ME is a disease that predominantly affects women, and women's health is sadly not taken as seriously as men's. You know this, I know this, you were there when I spoke all about the history of hysteria. There is so much evidence for this phenomenon that I shouldn't need to provide any, but I will anyway, just for fun. I'll just throw a few studies on the screen and we can all be depressed about it together. It especially doesn't help when your predominantly female illness was given a name in an event which was later tied to an outbreak of mass hysteria, so these patients already weren't being taken seriously from the beginning. Secondly, this disease is very complex. It doesn't just affect one system of the body, but multiple, and it seems like it has a few different triggers. It might even be a group of very similar illnesses or different variations of one illness under the same name, considering the fact that so much variability in severity can be observed among ME patients. So you won't find a full explanation for what's going on with these patients if you're just looking at one system or one organ at a time. You have to look at them all together. This makes it tricky to do biomedical research on it well, as it requires a coordinated effort from different kinds of specialists. To put it simply, complex diseases like this are just hard to understand, and until what ME is gets figured out, there's no definite explanation for the origin of what's going on in these patients. And that leaves space for psychology to swoop in and offer up a psychological explanation. Thirdly, again, as Jennifer Breer points out, it's frustrating for medics when they aren't able to help patients. I mean, that's why people do the job in the first place. You have to go to medical school for a long time to be a doctor, so when you go through all that effort just to end up with a patient sat in front of you who is clearly struggling with something that you can't help them with, it's annoying and bruises the ego. Doctors want to be able to offer people with ME something, and psychology says they can. The fourth thing is that, as I said in an earlier episode, as awful as this illness is, routine tests performed on patients will still come back saying everything's normal, and this further paves the way for doubt. The fifth thing, and this is massive, is tied to the hallmark symptom of PEM. Exercise, usually, is good for anyone, for any patient suffering from any disease, except this one. Exercise is a kind of panacea in medicine, so you'd be forgiven for finding it confusing that there exists an illness that is such a medical anomaly that its sufferers are made worse by exercise. You might even think that that sounds impossible. Clearly, some people certainly did. The sixth thing is related to the fifth thing. ME is defined by a persistent, debilitating, medically unexplained fatigue beyond fatigue that is made worse by exercising. From the outside, especially in a society that praises productivity above all else, this risks looking like laziness. And laziness, I think, is seen as going hand in hand with the idea of a failure that a person has brought upon themselves. We patients absolutely aren't choosing this, but to some people, that might be exactly what it looks like. The final thing is simply the fact that admitting that ME is a real biological illness is scary. Because if you admit that it's real, and if you recognize how horrifyingly common it is, and that all it takes is catching some kind of viral infection for it to develop, then you have to admit that it could happen to anyone, at any time, and there's nothing you can currently do to completely shield yourself from it. You have to admit that it could happen to you, and that's so fucking scary to think about. You're just one virus away from ending up like me, or like Whitney Dafoe, or Jennifer Breer, or any of us ME patients. Your life, too, could be completely upturned overnight. But if you decide to believe that ME is psychological, if you believe that to some degree we patients are doing this to ourselves, then that helps to uphold a kind of facade that a lot of able-bodied people cling to, where they end up convincing themselves that they have an omnipotent level of control over the state of their health. People are quite often welded to the idea that this could never happen to me, but it could. ME could happen to you, and a lot of able-bodied people just aren't ready to face up to that truth. So it's easier for them to just not think of ME as a biological illness or to not believe that it really exists. We're going to continue talking about history in the next episode.